Well, hey, welcome to Small Town Charm. My name is Daniel. We got Chris. We got Mike here. And we're going to keep talking about... What are we going to talk about? It was a...
We're going to talk about the compromising and the
Data.
back.
Yeah, Data.
Data.
Ooh, Data. Like our favorite character from Star Trek. Mm-hmm. Never watched an episode of Star Trek or a movie. Oh, I saw that new one with Chris Pine a few years ago. The J.J. Abrams one. All the Winds First. I saw that one. I can't keep having these tiny hands. They're this jacket's not big enough to make the prank work. By the way, best $3 I ever spent at five below was this. Data. I know a little thing about Data because in my public comments at the public forum, I went for about 13 minutes with a word vomit of Data. I've learned one thing.
So good, by the way.
That was really good.
Still so good.
I've learned one thing though, and I should know better. But I think I kind of almost wanted to call attention to it because honestly, I thought I was fighting a losing battle in my public comments at that moment, which is I'm in the world of marketing and people make decisions based on emotion, and then they use data to back up what they've already decided with their emotions.
Right.
And so in my mind, didn't matter how much data I was going to provide. No one was going to change their mind, but I just wanted to show the great chasm between the data that those of us who were pro CD5 or density or whatever you want to call it, the great chasm there was between the data we had and the complete desert of data that the other side had. And maybe I accomplished that, but this data argument came up again in the BOC meeting.
Yep.
You mentioned this at the end of the last episode, which is why we wanted to talk about it this time. For audio listeners, I'm saying Chris brought this up. There was a couple of things. Number one, I remember Haley mentioning that her husband found a study on a town
Right.
or towns that were in the Midwest that had been around for like 60 years and what they did. And it's like, that was mind-blowing in my own way. It's like, obviously I'm selfish. I'm a self-centered person, like we all are in some way. I'm like, did you not hear my public comments where I cited like 17 studies? Mm-hmm. You found a study on towns that are 60 years old in the Midwest. It's like, there's such a divide there between those two things. You mentioned that Jessica Salamita had data.
Right.
Tell me about that.
So, I think just to set the stage of kind of where this started, because people may not have heard everything in the last episode. So, Commissioner Miller brought up the fact that while they were voting on the Village Main Street overlay CD5 changes, he noticed one particular amendment was that they were going to set the density at 15.
Yeah.
And they got through all the amendments, and then he specifically brought up the fact that I suggested 16. And you guys are now saying that it needs to be 15. Why is that? And he made this whole case for why he suggested 16, and it was based on studies that he had brought from other cities around the country and what kind of density, those kind of places required. Mm-hmm. He had real numbers. He had done a whole presentation on this. And Haley brought up the fact that, well, the reason it needs to be 15 is because I want to negotiate. So, that was her rationale for it. It was that's what it was. Jessica Salamita then inserted herself into the debate and immediately went after Joel and picked apart the fact that all of the data that he and Commissioner Adams had brought to the table were all from cities that had populations that were much, much larger than Nolensville. And so in her mind,
which is fair.
Yeah, in her mind, it was well,
I don't think it's fair, but I'll tell you about that in a minute. I want you to keep going.
Yeah, in her mind, it was well, if this city has a population of 100,000 people and they want 18 units per acre, then like really, if you like boil that down to Nolensville, we should have like 7. That was her rationale. And so she was like saying, I'm making a huge concession by going to 15. Joel then like countered by saying, look, like, he didn't use these words, but I'm gonna like paraphrase in
Do we have to make
the
it
Chris going filter.
Chris version.
Like, of what Joel said was basically like, look, like, y'all are just being assholes, and in reality, like, what this really equates to on paper is like 60 units, like, which
Right,
is,
yeah, if you spread that out over the
if you
the
spread
acreage.
like if we go to 16 versus 15, it's like 60 additional units on most of these parcels. That's a meaningful thing to a developer, and it's like meaningless to the town
us,
in terms
right.
of like us from like a population growth standpoint. So like, why are you really arguing over this? And then he made the statement, what I'm concerned with is we've met with developers like Land Innovations, and they have specifically told us they can't do the development for less than a certain density. Like, they have to have a certain density to make this economically viable. And so I'm just concerned that if we go with 15, if we don't come up to 16, really, I think he would want it higher, but he was compromising.
Yeah.
But he's saying, like, let's give them as much as we possibly can, because that will allow a developer to actually get this done and get a development built.
And like I said before, I'm okay with 15, because if it's not viable, you get to adjust it, and because it's form-based zoning, so the 15 there's a variance there, right? So like you can kind of design things around it to make, to kind of make up for the difference there. The 1 unit per acre is meaningless,
Right.
in either direction. The one thing that I did want to point out is that these studies, and I've seen these studies over the years in the Midwest towns that have 6 to 12 units an acre and they're viable. There is a very, very important data point that's missing from that conversation, is that these towns were all created 80 years ago.
Yeah.
And they were created on a much slower pace.
And for context, because a lot of people probably don't know this, Mike is from Chicago, like the suburbs of
You don't
Chicago.
know this? Shocked.
Grew up in like Chicago proper,
Right,
But also like lived.
So I mean,
the
this is kind of like, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the conversation that Haley had, at the public hearing about the 15-minute city. These things have become these theories. They're make believe examples of like how a utopia would work. And when you use a study that says that Midwestern downtown areas have 6 to 12 units per acre and they're viable, is you're not taking into account the fact that these things were sold off by parcel.
Right.
Like you can even go next door in Franklin, like that's all individual landowners. They didn't come in all at once in a master plan. They didn't have to buy the land at huge amounts of like huge parcels at huge inflated prices with today's interest rates. They came in and they were handed down through generations of land ownership.
Right.
Like the scale of development 60 or 80 years ago was so much smaller and was so much more manageable that you can do you can do a mixed use building with a first story pharmacy that 80 years later becomes a hipster bar,
Right.
with like a few units on top, and that makes it viable. Here, like you fast forward to 2023, where you like now land acquisition is hundreds of acres at a time, and you have investment groups. You have investment groups, and you have developers that are doing master plans. It doesn't become viable. So like when you quote these studies that that reference towns that were formed 80 years ago and try to apply it to today,
Right.
you're being intellectually dishonest
Right.
to the people that you're trying to,
Yeah. Like, for instance, like the density in Franklin is not like it's similar to what we're talking about, but it's less.
It's a lot less.
It's a lot less. But again, to your point, it's like Franklin was like a city from like the 1800s.
Yeah,
like,
and then you drive down a little bit down the street and you look at Cool Springs, and
Right.
then you're like, why? Like, what's being built in Cool Springs right now? It's all density.
Correct.
They have to infill people because they have to be able to provide the revenue.
But in fact, what Haley was describing in some of these like Midwestern cities that have like where she's pulling her density data is like, it's essentially like it's downtown Franklin, where it's like you have like a pharmacy that's now like Gray's on Main.
Right.
Right. Where it's like, it's now like a really hip bar and restaurant. or you have like an old like clothing shop that's now turned into like White's Mercantile, which is like a hip, like cool, like like boutique.
Even Puckett's was like, I mean,
correct. I mean, all those shops used to be something, but like now they are something more modern.
But they were all developed individually 80, 100, 150 years ago, and like the small scale, like that. That would be my goal. My goal would be like you put in a road, and Chicago did that after a fire. I don't know if you guys noticed. I'm from Chicago. After the fire, the city came in and gridded out the entire city. And they basically plowed everything over, and they put in roads and put in alleys, and then they lotted out the city, which traditionally a Chicago lot is like 25 feet by 125 feet, right? And then they sold all these off individually, and people were able to go in and build whatever they could afford at the time. That's why it looks so different than a master plan community now.
Yeah.
Like, I wish we can go back to that time where like we still had the ability to for small scale downtown development. We don't. It's just not where our economy is at. It's not the part of the country where that's viable. We have to be realistic in terms of how we're going to get development, and majority of them, if not all of them, are going to come in master plan communities.
I wish we could do that in Nolensville too, because then we could have like our own version of Al Capone opening speakeasies,
right?
Like.
And tunneling underneath the road.
Yeah, like we would have a speakeasy in like the back room of like the library in Nolensville or
So
something.
one thing that I would have loved, I actually said this out loud in the meeting. I broke some rules, but
I broke some rules.
Yeah, I believe it was Haley, the mayor, that mentioned how she didn't want to consider towns like that were like on the outskirts of Atlanta or this or that, because a lot of these towns were near tourist spots, and that wouldn't work. That doesn't apply. I said something like, "Oh, you mean like Nashville?" Like the third most popular tourist destination in the country right now.
Yeah.
Like, why wouldn't that example be a perfect example for us?
The second fastest growing metro area in the United States, outside of Austin.
So
it's pretty significant.
Yeah. The other thing that I thought about was when all these Midwest towns that they cited, was I'd love to see some kind of line graph over time or something of like the financial stability of those towns. How many of those towns went through several periods in their lifetimes where they were hanging on by a thread, and through some kind of sheer stroke of luck managed to survive through whatever they had?
So in Chicago specifically, all the towns that are thriving now are towns that had a rail line running through them. So you didn't need the density per se, but you had people from the city like taking the train and buying up property for their vacation homes and buying up property to get away from the city. So like if you look at all the Chicago suburbs and the ones that are around now and thriving, all have the train tracks, and the train station to this day is a very prominent part of their town where they have parking, and people will live there and to this day will continue taking the train into the city to work. Like that's a very big aspect of that.
One of the things that kind of struck a nerve with me was, I believe it was, I don't think I heard this in the BOC meeting, but in the public forum, I heard this a couple of times. And it's the same sentiment that you guys are describing that was coming through this, which is, oh, you guys are using these larger population towns as an example. Nolensville is different and special, and those things don't apply to us. So I work for a company that has franchises all over the country. We have over 100 locations now all over the country. I have never met a franchisee of our company, I run the marketing for the company, who doesn't say, I'm special and different than everybody else. The whole purpose of a franchise is we have a business model, we have best practices, we have an operations manual for your business, we have a way to run your business start to finish that if you just follow the instructions, you'll be successful.
Right.
I have never met a franchisee who was struggling though, who was following that instruction manual.
Yeah.
So 100% of the people who follow our process that they paid for succeed.
Yep.
100% of the time. So something being quote unquote boilerplate doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It's
Right.
actually better that
It's proven,
It's
yeah.
proven. It's in the same way. I used to run a side business where I taught drummers how to become professional drummers. And the biggest talking point I had for them was, look, in my own life, I actually went from knowing nobody and becoming a professional drummer. I actually did it twice in my life.
Yeah.
I did the whole process twice. I decided to start it again one time after, many years of not doing it. Both times I modeled what I chose to do after somebody else or several people who were successful at doing the thing I wanted to do.
Was it David Grohl?
No, I wish I could be like him. That'd be amazing. But again, it's like the idea that something being unique is the indicator of it being good doesn't work, especially in some kind of business focused thing. And I think
Right.
a town at the end of the day is a business. It needs to make enough money to support all of
Yeah.
its expenses.
So I mentioned David Grohl because I just very recently watched an interview with him, and this isn't a recent interview. It was recent to me, and he was like, David Grohl. I'm 36. He's like the pinnacle of alternative music. So like, and the thing that he was saying is like, I didn't reinvent the wheel. All I did is I listened to bands from the 60s and 70s, and I just did what they did.
Yeah.
Like I just, I kind of, combined some styles, but I didn't like make a new genre of drumming. I just did the stuff that sounded really cool, and I just did it. Like in this interview, he actually like went on to say, he's like, I'm not that good of a drummer. I can hold a beat.
Right.
Actually, most of the drum beats that he's known for, on like Nevermind by Nirvana,
Yeah.
he didn't even record. It was a different
was
drum.
a-
There was a different drummer in Nirvana that
He had a
that
double.
wrote-
He had a,
like most of the hits, like "Smells Like Teen Spirit" and stuff like that, weren't Dave Grohl.
oh, you just ruined like
on the
my entire
recording.
childhood.
Like he learned those beats and then became
But-
the drummer and played them.
But the sentiment that you're expressing
Yeah.
is correct, which is you don't need something to be so special. I hate to tell people this. Nolansville is not special.
Right.
It's going to be real special. Thankfully, it's not going to be because we passed some stuff, zoning stuff. It was going to be real special that it's a town that just was going to get absorbed by Brentwood or something anyway, even though that's why the town was formed all those years ago.
Right.
If we didn't do something
Yeah.
better soon, thankfully we dodged that bullet. But the idea of negotiating for the sake of negotiating,
Right.
or stretching to find a piece of data.
It's scorekeeping. You're trying to like be okay.
Yeah.
Like I got enough points in to where I'm okay with this.
I think the thing that like a lot of people don't understand, or maybe and I'll say maybe like we could stretch that and say they do understand it, they just don't think about it that often, which is like this kind of like meta like philosophy of the fact that like, okay, you live in Nolansville, so like everything around you is your life, right? And we all just like think about like Nolansville as a small town and it's your surroundings, and like maybe you work in Nashville, but like you live here, your kids play sports here, you see your neighbors at everything you do, you eat at the local restaurants. People get like sucked into that. That's what drives this like thought process of like we're unique, because it's like, well, that doesn't exist most places. Kind of true. That doesn't exist in a lot of places today. But what people like, it makes people lose sight of the fact that like we also live in like the zeitgeist, which is like America.
Yeah.
And if you look at who are building houses here, most of the home builders here are national builders, right? Like Drees, Jones Brothers,
Yeah, that's true.
like Fox Ridge, Ryan, / Ryan. Like most of these builders,
Beezer.
yeah, like most of these builders are building homes all across America. Like I guarantee you could just transplant like whatever model home you live in Burberry Glen, you could probably go find that same model home.
Oh hell yeah!
In like the middle of Nebraska, or in like like some farm town like outside like
There's a house.
Wichita, Kansas.
There's a house being built on Burke Hollow right now, right at the corner of Burke Hollow and Clovercroft.
Yeah,
it's this house.
Yeah, exactly.
It is this house.
So like, I think people like fail to recognize that like, yes, what makes Nolensville unique is the fact that like all these people moved here, and they want it to remain somewhat like quaint and small, and everybody wants to be invested in the community. What doesn't make Nolensville unique is the fact that like everyone lives in a like cookie cutter home to some extent that's built by a national builder, and like
if you got a ship like wall in your house, you're not unique.
Dang it, Mike.
But I think to that point, it's like what that drives in the whole like zoning conversation is like people don't recognize that like, okay, like because you have those kind of home building things going on in your community, that also drives like commercial development.
Yeah.
That type of commercial development though could go like one of two ways. So it's like either commercial developers are going to come in and be like, hey, you know what? Like there's a bunch of soccer moms here that like all love Joanna Gaines, and there's enough of them that we should build Target because they will buy Hearth and Hand products in the droves, and Target will be interested in that.
It's kind of like your point where you mentioned in the earlier episodes of like we're still able to kind of produce the support that we need if we care deeply around an issue. It's like if you look at like BOC meetings or the PC meetings, the audience, and like this is not derogatory, it's just fact. The audience is like 60 plus, right? So like, but like if you look at data, Nolensville's median age is like 35, 36 years old.
Correct.
So the representation that goes and is vocal on the mundane things or the things that a lot of people don't care about, like that's a skewed data point. And when an issue comes up in terms of like long-term projections, it's very easy to drum up support of like, hey, like you're 35, you're 36, you have kids, you live in a subdivision, you're basically 95% of Nolensville, like would you mind showing some support? And that's how the BOC gets swamped with 100 emails saying like I want the village, because like that's we're not unique in terms of like what type of town we are, because there's a lot of towns like Nolensville. We're not unique in terms of like the town demographics or just overall we're not unique. There's a lot of little Nolensvilles out there, especially next to big metro areas. Like what people refer to when they say we're unique is like the people, right?
Yeah.
So it's like I'm able to go into me and Loretta's and know the owner, and like that feels good. That feels like a small town. But when I moved here, me and Loretta's, Birdie's was not around. Like I'm kind of crowning on that idea of like I've been here long enough to where I'm almost old school because I'm coming up on 5 years, and like when I moved here, like a lot of the stuff wasn't here,
right?
And all the stuff that came after I moved here made Nolensville so much better.
Right.
And that's the stuff that I think about of like, how are we unique? Like, we're very unique in terms of like, an owner of a restaurant is a very funny, very well-known like figurehead on a Facebook page where like he drums up support for his business. And there's a food truck that like has been parked all throughout town, and like we kind of all embrace that as a community. That's what makes us unique in terms of like having our own uniqueness, because everybody does that, but our own uniqueness doesn't come from us being a small town on the south of Nashville. Our uniqueness comes from like just being able to live here and developing this community that just makes it a unique community in itself.
Here's a point that I think some people picked up on, but a lot of people missed. Like that I really want to give props to Derek, Commissioner Adams, for like never wavering on. So he's like touted CD5 and a village and all this kind of stuff from the beginning. He's always spoke about it as we want to have a regionally attractive town center. And I think maybe the messaging could have been worked on because it was probably lost on some people what that meant. Mm-hmm. But like we were at this crossroads of like we could go one direction with growth and not be unique. Like we could just be like every other town that develops as a suburb.
Right.
where we have like really nice houses, people with lots of money, and all we build is strip malls with like huge retailers.
Best Buy.
Or
Like Spring
Yeah.
Hill.
or
Like
we,
Spring
we
Hill, that's
or we
very
could be
fair.
like a different version where we don't zone in such a way that allows that, but really we zone in a way that like builds a development that is what Franklin was 150 years ago, right? So it's like nobody's thinking about that these days though. Like that does make us unique. What we just got in this vote is unique. So like we have all of the suburbia that like you could possibly want.
Right.
What we just got approved though was like anti-suburbia. It was like we're gonna take suburbia and make it like the quintessential version of what you want suburbia to turn into, which is like a small town within suburbia surrounding it.
I said this to some people the other day. We all hung out. I am so excited because Williamson County has nothing like this.
Correct.
We knocked it out of the park.
It doesn't
At
exist.
that.
Yeah.
This will be the template for choosing your own destiny as a town. That I think again, if it just happens that we were all involved in Better Nolensville. If Better Nolensville was a template that towns are using to change their charter or change their government, this decision, which we cannot take near as much credit for this as we could for maybe Better Nolensville, which again it was up to people voting, but this zoning thing, the way it worked out, I think couldn't be better for the future. And I know we spent a lot of time kind of arguing a argument that we already won on these episodes, but I do think it's important that people understand, again, like I mentioned at the beginning, how our government functions. And for the next 2 years, if there's anything else that comes up like this, the way that some of our representatives might approach things and how we can work with them, because I think that worked out in our favor to work with them at the end of the day, and how there are always going to be voices who might be irrational or unwilling to look at data because they feel a certain way about a topic, how we can either bring them along with us or at least win when we know there's data to beat that. So I think it's important that we had these conversations, and I'm excited about the next 5 or 10 years now in town. Honestly, probably wouldn't have felt that way if things had gone a little differently.
Yeah. Would have felt excluded and not represented.
Yeah. So I'm very encouraged by all that's happened. We're out of time for this episode. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. This is Small Town Charm. We'll see you again real soon. Bye for now.